Okay, so let us continue our lectures on metaphysics. And in the previous lecture, we talked about natural laws and why we need universals to explain the existence of natural law. We looked into a couple of different formulations, the all statements, and then the normal all statement, the probability all statement. And then we saw the different problems that it would face, and they were not able to justify the problem of induction, as we said. So those types of arguments that we usually use very commonly, in a sense that we say salt is water soluble, this is salt, therefore this dissolves in water. And then based on those discussions, we said that, okay, that means that we need the universals of kind and properties to be able to explain natural law. And today we will look more closely at what this means. So now we have all four categories that we need. The categories of kind, properties, objects, and modes, the formal ontological categories, and the formal ontological relations between them of instantiation, characterization, and exemplification. And then we also specified that the relation between kind and property, that characterization, is exactly what we mean by natural law. But we also said in the last lecture that we need to revisit, based on this format, everything that we know about the empirical data, empirical science, natural laws, observations, and try to understand it in this new light. And as we will see, this structure of this ontology will be able to explain very simply those problems, those different properties that we were looking for that were very difficult to explain by those other alternatives, and that's the merit of this ontological framework. Okay, so let's go back to the argument that we had. Three statements. One was salt dissolves in water. Two was that this is a crystal salt and therefore this dissolves in water. And we said that we want to accept that argument as it is, and that led us to the existence of universals, because the first premise can be written as salt, which is a kind of thing, is characterized by water solubility, which is a property. Both of them are universals, and that's why exactly we need universals to make sense of this premise. So this is now the relation between kind and property. The second premise is that this specific crystal salt that we're pointing at is an instance of the kind salt. So this is an instantiation relation. And in the end, we say, therefore, this object is disposed to be. That's why we're using the present simple. This dissolves in water. We're not saying that this is dissolving in water. We're just saying that this dissolves in water. What we mean is that this is disposed to be water soluble. Now, if we look at the triangle that we have here, the part of the ontological square that we had, we see that what we are basically doing is we said that the upper part, the upper edge of this triangle is the characterization of salt with water solubility. That's a natural law. And then we say that this salt crystal is instantiated by salt. So the conclusion that we are getting is actually the relation that we have encountered before called exemplification. So the conclusion is that if this salt is an instance of the kind salt, and the kind salt is characterized by water solubility, then this crystal salt is exemplifying the water solubility in a dispositional way. Because if you remember, exemplification had two different forms. One was the substantial or dispositional exemplification, and the other one was a current or accidental exemplification. And this argument is using the dispositional exemplification. So that's all we'll be doing, and that's why it's very common, because objects exemplify properties all the time. And that's how we talk about them and how they would behave and how we would expect them to behave. Because we know the natural law, and based on the natural law, we use that to talk about the dispositions of the particular things that we have. Again, just imagine how common that is. That's why we do science, right? The science tells us a natural law, and then we start using it. But how do we use natural law? We apply it to particular things. But to be able to apply to particular things, that means that we are putting these two edges together, and that's exemplification. So everywhere that we are using natural laws, we are doing the same type of argument, and that's why we claim that we must take this as granted and then just see what it implies. Okay, so this is the argument, and now we can look into what this implies. Basically, what can we infer from all of this beautiful, in my opinion, structure of seeing natural law and particular objects, in play with each other. So one of them is that natural law is only about dispositions. It's never about occurrences, right? Because if you look at the triangle, the natural law is in the universal part characterizing salt and water solubility for the upper triangle, which is dispositional exemplification. We only talk about disposition, not occurrences. That's why natural laws are always in kind of present simple term. It's never in like is and continuous form. And that's also why we can never really observe natural laws, because whatever we're observing is something that is occurring. You can never see natural law there as an occurrence. The only thing that we can do is to infer from those occurrences what the dispositions are. And as we can see, we will see in a moment how we can do that. So that's the first point that this whole ontological structure is telling us. That natural law is about dispositions. So what are occurrences? Occurrences are when multiple objects with different dispositions now come together, and then they start interacting with each other, and then something occurs. So because everything is an object and every object is following natural law, when they come together, everyone comes with its own disposition. And what occurs is the sum result of these multiple dispositions. So for instance, you have the salt with the disposition that is exemplifying the water solubility, that specific crystal salt, and then you have that specific water, which again is exemplifying the power to solve, being a solvent, and then you put them together, and now something occurs. That's when the salt is dissolving in water, or water is dissolving salt. That's an occurrent thing. But that means that there are these two dispositions coming together, and the sum result of these dispositions becomes what is occurring right now. 3, this means that there can be many cases in which a natural law does not occur. You see, so these are the exceptions that we were talking about last time, and we had a difficult problem in alternative theories to account for those exceptions. But here is actually very easy to see why that's the case. Exceptions are not exceptions to the natural law, because natural laws are not about occurrences. So nothing that occurs can be against the natural law, because natural law is about disposition. There can be many cases in which a natural law does not occur. Why? Because natural laws are about dispositions, and occurrences are the total sum of multiple dispositions. So it is possible that one disposition blocks the other disposition from occurring. So for instance, you might have a bird that is disposed by natural law to be black, to be able to fly, to have feather. But because of some problem that it has, some disease, some genetic defect, something else is bringing some disposition into place and is blocking that disposition to produce black feathers. And then you get, for instance, an albino defective version of that thing. But that's not an exception to the natural law, because the natural law is about dispositions and it's not about what occurs. So that's explained easily. This also explains that why is it that with only one occurrence, it can be enough to infer dispositions and natural laws. Because if I tell you somehow a priori that the experiment, that what you're about to observe is just one object, just one pure object, manifesting or occurring, not occurring, what you will observe is an occurrence of the manifestation of that disposition that object has. Like if I tell you a priori that nothing will interfere with the disposition of that particular thing that you're doing the experiment on, if you know that a priori, then what you observe, it will be purely because of that disposition. So even one occurrence can be enough for you to get disposition and natural law out of it. And that's why we do very expensive experiments. That's why it makes sense to do very expensive experiments. Because expensive experiment means that I'm trying to make sure that whatever happens is only happening because of the dispositions of that thing that I'm studying. If I know that, if I make sure that I know that, then whatever occurs is only and only due to disposition of that specific thing. And that allows me to get natural law out of it. Again, getting from one occurrence to the natural law, it was very difficult to justify using the alternative ways of looking into natural laws. This also shows why we repeat the experiments. It's not because of the probability theory in the alternative one that we discussed before. Rather, it is to reduce errors in detecting what occurred based on dispositions of what kind of objects. These can be different sources of errors, right? Because one, as we said, we're supposed to infer from what's occurring and what kind of objects we have to what the natural law is. If we make sure that the kind of object that we have is exactly what we need, what we want to be there, and if what's occurring, if we can measure exactly what is going on, then even one occurrence is enough to get the natural law out of it. But we might make mistakes because, of course, what's occurring is not always as simple as seeing that the salt is dissolving in water. Many experiments, you need very expensive sensors to actually know what's going on there. What it is that is occurring there, and there can be errors there. There can also be errors in terms of what kind of objects we're dealing with. You might think that you're dealing with salts, but it might be some other ingredients involved with it that you don't see, and then you put them in the water, and now it's not dissolving. You say, what's going on? I just poured a cup of salt into water, it's not dissolving. Well, because you were not careful enough. There's some other elements. Some other element came with the salt into the water, and that element had a disposition to block the salt from dissolving in the water. And that's where your experiment is not showing what you expect to show. So we see that all the statements that we had for the other alternatives that were problematic for those, it can be explained simply in terms of there's ontological categories that we explained, and that's the merit of this framework. So we know natural laws, and then we said that the natural laws are those characterization of some kinds with properties, and thus we call those kinds natural kinds. So natural kinds, we mean the kind of things that explain the natural law. So salt is a natural kind. It's a kind of thing, and we have a natural law governing it. That's just a term that we will use. Why is it? Because for kind of things, we are dealing with basically two different categories. One is the natural kind. But the natural kind, as we said, is about the natural laws. But there are also other laws. As if you remember, we were talking about objects, and objects are defined based on their identity and synchronic and diachronic identity condition. That is, identity and existent conditions. Which means that they are also part of ontological categories. So, for instance, we have different natural kinds. For instance, lumps of gold. Imagine you have a lump of gold, or you have a lump of clay. You have a dog. You have human. These are different natural kinds, and each one of them comes with its own natural law. Or you have a table. You have a watch. These are also natural kind. Natural. I mean, for artifacts, it's a little bit of a stretch that term, but we can call them natural because they will have some natural laws governing how they behave. Now we can put these natural kinds inside a category because we can collect all of them, and then we say, okay, The ontological kind gives identity and persistent conditions to its members. So now we have these lump of gold and lump of clay. We look at their identity condition, and then we see that they're all the same, in a sense that a lump of anything, of some matter, is this just continuous parcel of particle together that if you change its form, it doesn't go out of existence. You can have a clay and you can play with it. It's the same lump of clay. That's what we mean by a lump of clay. Or a lump of gold, you press it a little bit on this side, on that side, it's the same lump of gold. So the identity condition doesn't really depend on what natural kind it is. If it's gold, if it's clay, it doesn't matter. The point is that all of them follow one kind of conditions, one set of identity and persistent conditions. So that's why we put all of them into this ontological kind, and we call it a lump of matter. So a lump of matter is an ontological subcategory of the ontological category kinds or sorts in general. So there's a hierarchy going on here. And then we have other animals like dogs and humans, and we put all of them into an ontological category of living beings. Living beings, as the name suggests, is the identity and persistent condition is seems to be based on the life that they have. As long as it's the same life, then it's the same animal, So you have a cat, it might lose its leg, it might lose its eye, but as long as it's alive, is your cat, is the same cat. So you might change a person's heart, you might change a person's lung, but as long that person hasn't died, it's the same life, it's the same person. So we put all these different animals, because their identity condition is based on the life that they have, under one ontological category. These are the category of living beings. They are identified based on the life that they have. For artifacts, it might be a bit more tricky. But the whole idea is that we have these different natural kinds actually existing, but we really don't care, because if you remember, metaphysics is about the possibilities. So we don't really care about what actually is the case, like different kinds of things. I mean, nature could have had different kinds. That's not really the interesting point. The interesting point is talking about the ontological laws. That's what we're doing here, the ontology. So we just call them a lump of matter, or living beings, or artifacts, or sets, or different things that we will see in the future as ontological kinds, or ontological subcategories of other categories. So they provide identity and synchronic and diachronic identity conditions for objects that instantiate them. And we will call them ontological kinds, because we had the natural kinds providing natural laws. So let's call lump of matter, living beings, these different things, ontological kinds or ontological categories that define ontological laws. So ontological kind provides ontological laws such as synchronic and diachronic identity conditions, and natural kind within those ontological kinds provide natural laws such as tigers being a carnivore. Now, we talked about metaphysics and natural science in the beginning, and now with the information that we have now, we can look back at it and understand it in a better light. So natural science deals with empirical data. And empirical data are occurrences. There are events. There are things that happen. When we measure something, when we look at something, we look at what's happening at that moment. And events include different objects. We haven't really gone into, I don't think we will ever go into ontology of events, maybe a little bit, but that's just the basic information that we need to know, that events obviously include objects because they are particular things. And objects require synchronic and diachronic identity conditions. But identity conditions are ontological laws, and ontological laws require metaphysics. You see, so when we do natural science, we are presupposing a metaphysical foundation. For instance, let's suppose that someone is investigating this bird. You're doing natural science. you are observing the behavior of this bird, and let's suppose that we're going to a very simple example. Suppose that you're looking at the bird, and the bird rotates its head. Now, if the bird rotates its head, you're not going to write down that, okay, we had a bird, and that bird went out of existence, and a new bird came into existence with a new direction that it was looking at. Why not? Well, because you say, okay, it was the same bird. It's just looking at that direction, and then it rotated its head. But you see, when you say that, you're basically assuming that a bird can rotate its head without stop being the same bird. But that's not a trivial thing, because remember, we were talking about this, and we said that you might have a book. You open that book, it's the same book. But if you have a statue and you open it, you destroy that statue. What determined that what kind of change it can go through without going out of existence? That was a diachronic identity condition. It's the identity condition of book that allows me to say that I can open this book and it's still the same book. But if I do that with a statue, I'm destroying that statue. So when you say that it's the same bird rotating its head, you're assuming an identity condition for that bird, which means that you're assuming that that bird falls under an ontological category, which means that you're assuming an ontological and basically an ontology. So when an empirical scientist says, oh, I don't care about metaphysics, what he basically means that I don't care about examining the metaphysics that I have, because it's just impossible to do natural science by this set of simple statements that we see here. You just cannot collect data and interpret data without having an ontological framework. So again, it's not possible to do natural science without metaphysics. There's a very interesting example of this interplay between metaphysics and natural science. Take the case of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. So we all know this. So the caterpillars can go into a metamorphosis and change their form and go from one natural kind as a caterpillar to a butterfly. And there are different kinds of things because there are different natural laws applying to them. So they go from one sort of thing to another sort, and that's why it's usually called a phase sortal. It's one organism, but at one phase of its life is one sort of thing, a natural sort of thing, or natural kind of thing. And it's another phase of its life, it's another sort of thing, it's another natural kind. Now this happens, which means that this is possible naturally. But the point is that it's possible naturally because it is possible metaphysically. Metaphysical possibility is necessary for natural possibility. Why is it metaphysically possible? Because both caterpillar and butterfly belong to the same ontological category of living beings. They're both living beings. So it is metaphysically possible for a caterpillar, the same organism, to become a butterfly. Why is it that it's possible when it is for the same ontological category and not possible when we have from different ontological category? Because we will face the relative existence problem that we had before. Remember, ontological categories define the persistent conditions of the objects. So if I have an object that moves from one ontological category to the other, to a different ontological category, and ontological categories are individuated based on the ontological laws or the identity conditions that they provide. So if you have two different ontological categories, we have two different identity conditions. So when one entity moves from one ontological category to another ontological category, it can stop existing as the original ontological category and start existing and exist as the second ontological category. But that's the relative existence that we talked about before, which is a very difficult idea to wrap our head around. For instance, let's suppose someone claims that I can turn a statue into a lump of clay. Remember, a statue and a lump of clay, there are different ontological. Lump of clay is a lump of matter. A statue is a statue. They're different. They have different ontological categories. they cannot be turned into each other. You cannot have one statue and then turn the same statue into a lump of clay, because let's suppose that that's possible. Let's suppose that you say, I have a statue, but I turned it into a lump of clay. But that means that if I get that statue and I start deforming it, it should still be the same statue. Because you said it's the same statue and I turn it into a lump of clay, but a lump of clay remains the same if you deform it. But if you do that, then you will have this lump of deformed clay and you're claiming that that's a statue. But that's nonsense. You have to say that, okay, the statue, yeah, it doesn't exist as a statue, but it's the same statue existing as a lump of clay. And that's the relative existence that we said we have to stay away from it. So that's why if two things, if we're talking about different ontological categories, it's metaphysically impossible to move from one ontological category to another ontological category. And it is metaphysically possible to move within one ontological category. And that's all the metaphysics says. It's only about possibility or impossibility. If it's impossible metaphysically, then it is also impossible naturally. If it's possible metaphysically, then it might be naturally possible, it might be naturally impossible. For instance, another very interesting case for this example is that, note that the metaphysic possibility that we're talking about is an a priori knowledge here. We don't need to look at, we don't need to know about these sort of things. If you just tell us that they are from the same ontological category, the metaphysics says is possible. You might have a caterpillar turning to butterfly, even if you haven't observed such a thing at all. But if it is metaphysically impossible, it's also a very powerful result, because it immediately says that you can never find that in nature. So for instance, in this process of metamorphosis from caterpillar to butterfly, if at any point of this process we have a dead organism, if somewhere down this line this organism dies and another organism starts, then this can never be the same organism, because it would be metaphysically impossible for that to happen. I mean, unless we can argue for another very shady thesis, that's intermittent non-existence, that something can go out of existence and then come back as the same entity. But let's suppose that's not the case. If a death happens somewhere in the line, then we're losing that life that we had in the beginning. So we have no reason to suppose that these two life are the same. So metaphysics says that, hey, like, that cannot be possible. You should have, basically in that case, what's happening is one organism dies and a new organism comes out of the ashes of the other one. But that's not what's happening. In the caterpillar to the butterfly, it's the same organism because the organism never dies. You see, so based on this, as we said, metaphysics gives you the possibility as a necessary condition for natural possibility. So for instance, changing from cats to dogs is metaphysically possible because they're both from the ontological kind of living being. But it seems naturally impossible. I mean, we haven't seen it. But it might be that can happen. But at least it seems naturally impossible. Changing from lump of clay to lumps of gold, what some alchemists on the world, they were not trying to change lump of clay to lump of gold, but lump of any other inferior metal to lump of gold is metaphysically possible because it's just lump of matter. But again, it seems naturally impossible. But I guess we do have metamorphosis not only in biological sense, but also in minerals. We do have a kind of metamorphosis. So this is where the metaphysics says that it's possible, but nature, it seems that it says that it's impossible. But we have also the other way around, which is the more powerful way, because that's when the metaphysics says impossible and immediately a priori says that that can never happen in nature. For instance, changing from lumps of matter into living organism is metaphysically impossible because they're, again, two different ontological categories. And that's very interesting. Changing from lumps of matter into living organism is metaphysically impossible. Note that this doesn't mean that life cannot emerge, we cannot have life in nature. What it all says is that in the same sense that a lump of clay cannot become a statue, can only constitute a statue, or a statue cannot become a lump of clay. All this says is that a lump of matter can never become a living organism. We have a line. We obviously know that this happened, right? So we had, at one point in time, there were no living beings, and now there are living beings. So that means that there was a line. Left of that line, we look, we see no living beings. It's only lumps of matter. The right side of that line, we see living beings. The correct interpretation that metaphysics tells us that we need to do is not to say that this matter became alive. No, the matter cannot become alive. The only thing that can happen is that a new entity comes into existence at that point, which is a living being, and that living being is constituted by the same lump of matter. So you have one lump of matter going through that line, but after that line, a new entity comes into place. Billions of years ago, that happened, right? A new living being came into existence. But that was not a lump of matter turning into a living being. That was a living being came into existence and being constituted by that lump of matter. As I said, this example, changing from lumps of clay into a statue, is impossible. What's happening is that you still have the same lump of clay, but now that lump of clay is constituting a new entity, which is a statue. The statue was not there, now it exists. It comes into existence. You create that statue, and that statue is now constituted by that lump of clay. We had one entity before, now we have two. The other interesting one is that changing from animals into a person is impossible. Now, I haven't talked about the ontological kind person. We will talk about it in a couple of lectures. But for now, just know that person and animal, different ontological categories. What we're saying is that if that's the case, then changing from animals to person is metaphysically and naturally impossible. Which basically means that, again, there are persons right now, you and I are persons, but there was a time, if you go back enough, that there were only animals, no persons, because even if you go back even further, they're not even living animals, living beings there. So the correct diagnosis, again, based on metaphysics, is not that we say, okay, there was this animal human being of a particular instance of Homo sapiens on this left side of the line, and then on the right side, it became a person. No, a human being can never become a person. The best thing that can happen is that on the right side of the line, a new entity comes into existence, and that's a person. And that person is constituted by that animal, in the same sense that that animal itself is constituted by a lump of biological tissue. So, yeah. I mean, if we understand this kind of ontological categories and the relation that exists, the formal relation that exists between these ontological categories, we can see a very neat interplay between metaphysics and natural science. And I believe it can explain many things, and it can open up lots of interesting discussions, lots of interesting discoveries, even though we're doing a priori metaphysics. When this a priori metaphysics, that's the possibility, is combined with the natural science, that's when we get to a very good understanding of the nature. And most of the confusion usually in history is that people tend to think that we only need one of these two legs to understand it. Someone says, oh, I can only do everything with empirical science, but as we saw, that requires metaphysics. Or someone might say, okay, no, I can do metaphysics. Or some people expect too much from metaphysics. They say, okay, metaphysics means that I just sit down on my armchair, start thinking, and a priori understand everything about the actual nature that exists right now. Well, that's just expecting too much. And of course, if that's what you expect from metaphysics, then you're going to get disappointed, because metaphysics in the end is just about possibilities. Beyond that, after you sketch the realm of possibilities using metaphysics, then you use empirical science to find the actuality within that realm of possibility. And together they can give us a very good understanding of nature.